to get on the bench in Canada. Amongst other things, amongst other spectaculars on that resume. It's not just that we have an extraordinary judicial figure, it's also that we have an extraordinary intellect and an extraordinary story of life and of careers, and therefore an inspiration to the world of Fletcher. And if you come from a culture in which courtesy titles are important, you will suffer a crisis, as I do in introducing her, which is where the French language actually comes in handy, because all I've got to say is, Madame la juge, vous avez la parole.
Voilà. Merci, je suis très heureuse d'être ici. Mais I think I'll speak in English instead. Thank you for the warm welcome. Ian met me at the door and, as always, made me feel that Fletcher is a kind of home away from home, not only because I know Ian and his family and have for many years, an admired, deeply admired and respected family, and Ian has the DNA and the personality. So if you know Ian, you know why everyone in Canada loves his family. But also because Fletcher represents, to me, what has always seemed the most important component of the legal enterprise. And I appreciate your warmth and your introduction, but you let me add to the biography the defining event of my life, which explains just about everything that I've done since. And like many of you, it was an awareness that came late in my life, how formative the beginning of my life was, and came when I became a parent. So let me then start by telling you why my view of the world and the law is what it is. It gives me also a chance to tell you, having been a judge for 45 years in Canada, what I think the role of the courts and justice are. The role of international law to me is preeminent, even though most lawyers don't know what it is and don't care what it is. And then I would like not to ignore what's going on in the Middle East, because it does affect everything I've always thought is the failure of international law. All of that in 10 minutes, because I really want to be able to have an exchange with you. I know what my views are about everything. I've lived with them for 77 years. I don't want to know what yours are. And I'm looking forward to the exchange. So let me start with the personal history. I was born in 1946 in Stuttgart, Germany, in a displaced persons camp. My parents were married on September the 3rd, 1939 in Poland, which was the day World War II officially started. My father was a graduate of the Jagiellonian Law School in Krakow, had his LLM, and many years later, about 10 years ago, I found a paper that my mother had kept his papers and gave them to me before a speech I was giving at the opening of Pier 21 in Canada, which is our Ellis Island. And there was a letter there from the judge, the Court of Appeal judge in the city of Radom, telling him that his examination as a judge was scheduled to take place in October of 1939. And of course, the war started on September 3rd, and he never got to be a judge. But I had no idea that being a judge was something that he had aspired to do. And in the European system, of course, you could take either the lawyer's track or the judge's track. So there I was as a judge reading that he had wanted to be a judge. We came to Canada in 1950. We were finally admitted. Jewish refugees were not being admitted to Canada. Nazi war criminals were, which is the subject of my husband's book called None is Too Many, about Canada's foreign policy, which was anti-Semitic and kept Jews out and allowed in so many war criminals. Nobody knew that at the time. We knew we couldn't get in, but Canadians didn't know that there was an exclusionary policy in the immigration department. One of the first acts my father made in 1950 when we arrived in Canada as a lawyer, he taught himself English in Germany and worked for the Americans and loved the Americans, and they loved him, and they were great to him. He was the head of the displaced persons camp in Southwest Germany where we live. And he practiced law in the courts, special courts that were set up for the DPs, and came to Canada and asked the Law Society what tests he had to write to be a lawyer. And they said, you can't, because you have to be a citizen to be a lawyer. And of course he wasn't, and that would have taken 5 years. He had a family to support, became an insurance agent, very happy, never heard him complain. Never heard either of my parents ever complain about anything, including the fact that their son was killed, their whole family was killed. They were just really happy to be in Canada. So that's the background, which as I got older made me understand the failure of law from 1939 to 1945. I'd never connected it to the legal order and international law, but it also gave me an intense loyalty to the Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, Declaration of Civil and Political Rights, all of the consensus documents that emerged from World War II define me. So that is why I believe in international law, because there wasn't any, and because I was the chrysalis of my emergence into the world was inhumanity, injustice. And without realizing it, I was absorbing all of that. I had no idea when I got to law school, which was the most boring 3 years of my life, that law was important. I saw no evidence of it, except as a Canadian, except that while I was in law school from 1967 to 1970, I was a passionate admirer of the Warren Court in the United States. And so my formative legal education was watching robust judicial intervention on behalf of rights. In Canada, on the other hand, robust judicial interpretation involved deciding whether egg marketing boards were provincial jurisdiction, we have 10 provinces, or federal jurisdiction. So dull and irrelevant. So American constitutional law was in my head as I became a lawyer. And then I graduated 1970 into the revolution, the social revolution of the 60s and 70s, women's rights, persons with disability, indigenous rights, persons of color. All of those were happening in the 70s. And in Canada in 1982, we got a Charter of Rights and Freedoms and an extremely bold judiciary to implement it. So there was none of this typical Canadian pussyfooting into this new area. Let's not make too many waves. They just boldly went into making sure that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was interpreted in a muscular way. Why do I tell you that? I tell you that because it's important when you're doing international law to understand the role courts play or don't play in the development of law. I am someone who believes in international law as real law. And the reason I think it is real law is because it needs to be enforced as real law and can affect the behavior of states. At the moment, it's only affecting the behavior of states who are good states. And I think we've got a lot to think about when the only enforcement comes from the low-hanging fruit. So the good people are talking to each other and the bad ones are getting away with anything they want to get away with. So we have to think about what the role is then for a legal regime that has no enforcement mechanisms other than the ones that are unacceptable to most countries, including mine and yours, boots on the ground. There is no moral center anymore. I find the United Nations a complete failure in developing a moral center. It has some excellent agencies, thank God for those, but as a norm forming body, it is useless, better than useless, because rhetoric takes the place of action, and people are slaughtered, and people are arrested, and people do to people what they want to do because they know there will be no accountability later. And I say that and include within that matrix the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. Every international institution is helpless, it seems, in enforcing the norms that protect people's lives. So what made me really think about how tragic all of this is that I also watched with great admiration the way the Marrakesh Agreement developed and how in 1995, is that when it started? People started panicking about whether there was an enforcement mechanism for economic issues and trade issues. And so we had the World Trade Organization, and after 25 years, until Donald Trump decided he didn't like it, it was up and running and enforceable. It took China 10 years to join, and people paid attention to the rules. They worried about enforcement. They took it very seriously. On the other hand, 65 years of human rights law at the time, nobody was taking that seriously at all. The stark contrast for me between the adhesion to the norms and requirements of trade law, which is economics and very important, no question, while the human rights abuses around the world continue unabated, was something I couldn't get my head around as a judge, as a lawyer, as a person. So that takes me to the Nevson decision, which is, for me, a metaphor of all of the above. The role of a judge, the role of the courts, the role of law, and why we have to make international law based in enforcement mechanisms. This was the case about 3 Eritrean refugees who escaped from a mine, which was largely owned by a Canadian company, Nevson. The political environment in Eritrea was that there was military conscription. The government, dictatorial government, kept people who were conscripted long beyond the 6 or 18 months that they were supposed to be there. The people who escaped, and the facts are in the judgment if you're interested, there was forced labor, there was slavery, there was abuse. And so they tried to sue the company in Canada. And of course, what the company said was, wait a minute, active state, you can't go after us. This happened in Eritrea. And the issue was, can Canada enforce compliance with customary international law in a domestic court? The preliminary issue was one raised by the company, the active state doctrine, which says you cannot go after a state. We have in Canada something called the State Immunity Act, which does protect states from actions in Canada, protected Iran, 2 people in Iran, from the murder of a Canadian photographer in a case called Kazemi. And you will see that I dissented in Kazemi. It was 8-1. It has from time to time been 8-1 in my life. But 8-1 became 5-4 in the Nevson decision, which is the evolution of the possibility of the way law starts to go from controversy to acceptance. I'll give you another metaphor. Gay rights started as a controversy in Canada. In the very first decision, which I also wrote, it was hugely controversial. When I struck down the criminal code prohibition against anal intercourse for 14 to 18-year-olds, although heterosexual sex was not a crime, 12 years later in Canada, we had gay marriage. So sometimes controversy teaches. The Kazemi decision, where this tortured photographer could not receive vindication in the Canadian courts. Got a lot of people thinking about the role of international law. And in this case, what the companies put up against these three refugees was not state immunity, but act of state, which was a doctrine we found was never applied in Canada. And although it protects state actors, this company is not a state actor and therefore was not immune. So what we declared was there's no such thing as active state in Canada, which people were shocked by until they looked at the analysis. And there were 7 of us on the court out of the 9 who found that there was no such thing as active state. So the question came down to the really interesting one, which is, can you enforce customary international law in a domestic court without ratification by Parliament or a legislature? And we said customary international law is part of Canadian law and therefore enforceable. And you don't need a government to say it's a law. It is part of Canadian law. And therefore, theoretically, this was a pleadings case, Nevson. It could go for trial on whether or not this company was guilty of breaching customary international law, norms of actually use code. You all know what use cogents norms are. Slavery, forced labor, crimes against humanity, cruel and inhumane treatment. And it was all sent back for trial to British Columbia. Guess what? The company settled because a trial would have brought out all of the things we got in the pleadings. The country, the world would have heard what was going on in those mines, and so they settled. And our decision stands. Whether it will have legs in other jurisdictions, I spend a lot of time talking to judges from other democratic countries about the need for judges to weigh in boldly in international law, because as you know, customary international law develops through custom. What is accepted, not use cogents. We know what the use cogents norms are. But opinio juris means, among other things, what do the courts in a domestic environment say about whether this is real law? And so we're trying to get other countries to play their role in developing international human rights norms that can be enforceable in domestic courts. I will close with this. The underlying issue in all of law, and you are all students of the law or teachers of the law, for me, is a term that gets bandied about casually and carelessly, and nobody does anything about it, and that is access to justice. And why do I say that? I say that because these people started their suit in 1806. I'm kidding, but by the time they got justice, it was 10 years, 5 years, years and years and years. We have a legal system that is so fixated on process that people don't get access to a remedy, even if there is a remedy at the end of the road. And I think we have to, that's certainly a problem even in domestic law. It is a huge problem in international law, access to justice. Remember, Milosevic was on trial for 4 years. And I just throw out the word Nuremberg 6 months later. What has happened? So read this little article from 1906 by Roscoe Pound, which he delivered to the American Bar Association, called Public Dissatisfaction with the Civil Justice System, about how in 1906, the law was too complicated, too expensive, too much like a trade, too adversarial. 1906. And I say in the speech I gave for the last 40 years, think about how people got to his lecture. Horse and buggy. People were using leeches. Child labor was normal. Women were not in the paid labor force. The whole world has changed since 1906, except how we do trials. And I say to lawyers, if doctors aren't afraid to experiment with life in order to find better ways to save it, how can we possibly say justice demands years and years and years and rules and rules and rules? It is unjust to have a justice system like we have. Look what's going on in Israel now. So it all ties back to what's going on right now. Every single rule of international law and human rights that we know of has been violated by the barbarity of taking civilians. What will happen? Will there be accountability? I predict that by tomorrow, people will start talking about proportionality and disproportionate and all of that good language that we should be thinking about, and we will lose sight of what happened and the disproportionate attack on civilians. And where was the law? And where was justice? And what world do we live in when 3-year-olds and grandmothers are abducted and kidnapped and nobody knows what's going to happen? We went berserk when we watched Daniel Pearl being executed, one person. And we called them terrorists. And now, we're careful, gotta use the right language, don't want to annoy people. And let me take you back to 1945. I'm not a fan of appeasement. I do not believe in Chamberlain's approach. And yet here we are, because we all want to try to get along. And because diplomacy is so important, and we often use it to allow people to get away with things we should not let them get away with. There's always a consequence. So the moral of this story, international law needs consequences. All law needs consequences. They need consequences in a timely and effective way. And let's argue about whether it's the right solution down the road. But in the meantime, we need to make remedies available for breaches of international law when they occur. Not rhetorical consequences, real consequences. And I don't know what they are, but I don't see a moral center in the world anymore. Frankly, I say this as a rude guest in your country. I don't see a moral center in this country anymore. So lots to talk about, lots to worry about. Sad for me because I grew up so hopeful and so proud to be a judge and to participate with judges from democracies around the world. We were on a trajectory of ever inclusive sensitivities to people who weren't in the mainstream. We were bringing them in. And now here we are, and it's wokeism, and we're not, it's identity politics. It's not identity politics, it's multiculturalism. You're bringing in people who were excluded, but the language is being turned on us. So the world I am talking about in front of you today is totally upside down from the world I started in, which was hopeful in 1946 when I was born. Everything was going on a path and seemed to continue on that path. We were ignoring the little things that were happening along the roadside because we thought they weren't the big story, but those little stories are the big stories. So Russia, China, Hamas, Ukraine. Where is it good? And that's for you to fix.
Thank you. Thank you. So, a lot to chew upon. And in all of that mix, the law of consequences. As you think about that, let's begin with the interaction. We'll start with the students and we'll end with the faculty. So we'll take them in in clusters of 3 questions or comments, if you've got any. 1 question per student. Any questions from amongst the students? You're not limited to asking about the ratio of Nevson and the Raya. You feel free to ask about anything, and you can ask about careers too, because there's an extraordinary career right in front of you.
Can I also say to the students, this may be the last chance you'll ever get to cross-examine a judge. So go for it.
That's the truth.
Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a second year MALD. I apologize, I'm still formulating the question, but I'm really wondering what your perception or experience has been with integrating international law at the domestic level, especially when you speak about democracies. So one of the issues that I found it is like, how do we reconcile that, especially when we have courts like the ICJ and the ICC that want to have that recourse, want to have coercive effects, but if the domestic, I guess, society doesn't agree to that, isn't that, I guess I find it hard to reconcile.
That's a very good question, and it's a very sophisticated question, and the answer is on so many levels. I think what you're asking me is, and tell me if I'm wrong, what do you do if domestic countries don't want to abide by decisions of international adjudicative bodies? I don't know. I actually honestly don't know. It's part of the problem that there are so many good laws, rules, and institutions in theory out there, like the ICJ, the ICC. In theory, excellent bodies. The UN, in theory, is an excellent body and was until Doug Hammarskjöld was killed. I think if you trace the arc, that seemed to be where it started to get paralyzed. But you're dealing with international relationships, and it's the interaction and intersection of diplomacy and law. And I don't know how that works because I've never been in one of those rooms. My rooms are 8 other people sitting around and thinking about what we think the public interest in our country requires. But democracy, I mean, you throw a very important word on the table that I should have talked about. I think part of the problem may be, particularly here in this country, but not just here, that the word democracy is a contested phrase, contested word. So I always thought of democracy as being the relationship between the majority as reflected in the people they elect and the courts, who are supposed to be the check on the elected representatives, and a media who observe all of the above. But it has come increasingly to mean in parts of Europe and the United States, the majority wants. I think once you start to think of democracy as the majority wants, then you're talking about the tyranny of the majority and you're forgetting about the importance of the checks and balances. The interesting thing about the United States to me, as somebody who teaches it here, is that I taught it the way I've explained it to you. The public gets its say through the people it elects. Judges don't get elected in any country except this one. They are there till they are 70 or 75, depending, or a term limit, depending on the country. They are not accountable to anything but the public interest. They are entitled to go against public opinion, because what does that even mean? I mean, is it my friends? Is it people who are rich? Is it people who, I don't know who the public is? And are judges supposed to take polls? So the checks and balances of independent, non-accountable in the traditional sense, people who don't have to go to the polls every 4 years, between those who do, is what keeps democracy alive. When, like this country, you have a judicial system that does protect minority interests, but minority interests that are against the majority's interest, and I'm talking about the Dobbs decision for interest, for example, or the Voting Rights Act, getting the Shelby decision, which got rid of the Voting Rights Act. When the court itself isn't a check on the tyranny of the majority, but imposes the tyranny of the minority religious views on the majority, taking away rights instead of expanding them, then my head has a bit of a problem explaining what the relationships are between courts and legislatures in a democracy. So that's part of the confusion now, because am I allowed to use a very sophisticated phrase like bad guys? The bad guys think they have a hegemonic right to their views. That's the other difference. Everybody thinks they are entitled to their view, not just to their view, that's freedom of expression, to the imposition of their view on those whose views are different. So we're not talking to each other anymore. We are expecting compliance with views which are antithetical to the protection of rights in this country, and in Hungary, and in Turkey, and in Poland, and who knows where, well, Russia, of course, we know, in China. So that's part of the problem with the discussion about democracy, which was so simple in a way in the 50s and 60s and 70s, even 80s. And then it started to get more complicated. So, I mean, you raise a whole bunch of questions. The key one you asked is, how do you get people to accept those decisions? I don't know. I mean, that to me is the ultimate question of international law, is enforcement. Enforcement without boots on the ground, enforcement without military enforcement.
Thanks so much for that. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Katie. Thank you so much. I just wanted to kind of go off of what you were just saying. So with the United States Supreme Court, we're hearing, all these suggestions for how to fix it, what's to be done. Term limits and expanding the court. But there's no agreement, there's no obviously solutions being presented. What's your view on the future of the US court?
So can I find out?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Is there anybody who wants to take any other question along these lines or something related? Yes, Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. Thank you so much for your wisdom. The question I have is a little broad, relating to your point about the retraction of the legal process as an impediment to timely and effective consequences. And I'm wondering what you think about the idea that maybe, for a specific example regarding Nevson, that process could act to facilitate solutions that don't even have to create that, don't even have to go through that process, like that settlement. Or I guess in another way, sort of the double-edged blade of, perhaps the double-edged blade of removing parts of the legal process, and maybe where you see excess that could be trimmed.
Two really good questions. Let me start with the easy one, because I don't know what the answer is to the United States Supreme Court, and I don't think there's going to be an answer. I mean, I think I was the only external person to give evidence to the Biden Commission. And I remember spending 3 weeks of the summer reading everything about the United States Supreme Court, because I wanted to be ready for anything that they asked me. And in the end, all they asked me was, how does it feel to have mandatory retirement? Because it was 3 weeks after I was mandatorily retired. I said, feels great. I knew I had a sell-by date the minute I was appointed, so that's no problem. What do I think is going to happen here? You're never going to change elected judges, which is the stupidest way to, I mean, the idea of judges having to respond to the majority, which is, as I said, the antithetical approach to what a judge should be, which is to be able to disregard the majority. But you can't disregard the majority if you're going back to them to get reelected. So that's not a good way to protect rights, and I believe judges need to protect rights. There's really no other place you can count on going. You should be able to go to the legislature, but so the solution of just adding on judges, you know, the history of the 1937 court packing plan where one judge changed his vote. It was called the switch in time that saved 9. Roosevelt would have added 3 judges because he was so frustrated that they kept blocking his New Deal. But then, you know, another government comes in and they add 3 judges, and then another government comes in, and then you've got a court of 55 people. So I don't know where that ends. And I don't know that anything is going to happen that requires agreement. Can you see anything you can't agree on military appointments in the United States because one person is holding them up. So I don't see any prospect for reform. And I don't even know what I would suggest except to go the way of every other democracy in the world, and that is a term limit of some kind. You can't retroactively impose it. I mean, that's just labor law. You don't impose retroactive disadvantages on somebody who is working someplace. But going forward, you got to start somewhere. But this is not the right moment, and it's not going to happen. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next election, which I actually also lose sleep over. Your question, how do I even approach that? If you were to summarize what your big concern is, what would it be? What would you want to see?
So I agree with the issue you raised about how the protracted legal process can put off solutions, but I guess I can't quite visualize or imagine ways to trim it that the adverse consequences are foreseeable in any way or mitigatable.
Let me propose something like this, because I don't know what the answer is either, except in Canada and probably here too, the book of rules of civil procedure is this thick. This is what you do if somebody can't come to court. This is what you do if you can't reach the other side. This is rule. I would be interested in a project in which 20 people sit around a table, none of whom is a lawyer. And you say to them, if you knew nothing about how the legal system is designed now, what would you say about what an appropriate way would be to resolve disputes? Now, remember in Rwanda, they got so frustrated with the International Criminal Court and how long it was taking to get resolution about the fact that all the Tutsis were murdered. They just couldn't get anywhere with the International Criminal Court. Should rape be included? Shouldn't it be included? Finally, they included rape. They set up, what were these called? The Gacaca courts, where they just decided internally as a community to mete out justice, to name names, to call them out, and it was done. Well,
their domestic system, though. I mean, it was their domestic tradition.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. We don't have to have necessarily this elaborate, sophisticated overlay of these new courts. That's not, we've decided that that's what justice requires. But if you ask ordinary people who are looking for justice what they want a remedy. If you ask people going through a divorce, they don't want to spend all of the money that they need for their kids. I mean, people aren't rich. They don't want to wait 4 or 5 years. If you ask somebody who's lost his or her job, how long they have to wait. If you go, I chaired a labor board for 5 years. We were supposed to be the alternative to the courts, a more expeditious resolution. But you know, courts are what define justice for lawyers. They go to law school, so they think the more it looks like a court, the more justice it is. And I, as a judge, coming into the labor board had to say to them, come on, stick to your process. We're not better. We're not better in the real courts. Do it differently. So my answer to your question is, I think we need to think about a whole new way to deliver justice that may not need 3 layers of appeals, may not need 5-week trials, may not need judges for everything, may not need appeals all the time. The labor board had no appeals. We had judicial review. So 1 out of every 200 cases got to the courts. Otherwise, we settled it. So let's stop think, what is it about lawyers that makes us think the way we've done it is the only way to do it? It's not a rebuttal. We've always done it this way. And do you remember the light bulb jokes? You know what the light bulb joke is about lawyers? How many lawyers does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Why? So, I mean, this is a moment again where people like you who worry can start thinking about new paradigms for the delivery of remedies, because there's no justice without remedies for somebody. But we have, I would say, 200 years from now, if we make it as a world, somebody's going to look back and say, boy, they had the best set of tools I've ever seen. Those were great laws. Those were great rules. Look at all those and amazing people doing it. Whoa. Oh, wait, we had the Uyghurs. How did that happen? So we had the Ukraine. We had Hamas.
So great people. Okay, there's a hand there. Any other hands around the room? Okay. All right. So 1, 2.
Hello, I'm Abella. I'm an LLM student here. I wanted to ask you something about access to justice, since you talked about it. A lot of what you talked about was related to common people maneuvering through the justice system, either international law or the domestic laws there. So I wanted to ask, how much do you think would compulsory legal education in high schools would help people like get more aware, be more aware, or in that way it might be more easy for them to maneuver through the justice system in their daily interactions with the law and the justice system.
Maybe, except what you'd have to teach is the system. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to ask another?
One more.
I'm Tushar. I'm also an LLM student here. My question is along the similar lines of what Abhinav asked. Since we were tracing back the failure of international law in light of the recent events, and also the lack of the failure of domestic systems to adopt international law. And I find that the bigger problem of the international law having consistently moving towards failure somewhere stands out to be the colonial traces behind the making of international law, and now its implementation in the contemporary times. So I'm trying to ask that if you're trying to revamp the whole system, as to what would be a better way to have these two systems function in the present world, how would you define the purpose of law, having seen how it was back in 1940s and even in later on? So in the present time, how would you define the purpose of law in the context of what Abhinav asked, access to justice?
Okay, the legal system and the teaching in schools. If at the moment, the problem is, to me, that you would have to teach the system that is not working. So would I design a course that teaches people about rights? Yes. I wouldn't design a course that teaches them about the legal system because it's incomprehensible anyway. But I think people should be taught their rights. The other thing that's missing is the teaching of civility. I don't know where it comes from, but I have to believe that the schools when I look at what's going on in the United States, people are not learning how to respectfully deal with one another. So I would say, yes, teach them about justice by teaching them what rights exist, and also teach them how to disagree with civility, because they are going to disagree. But what we're seeing now is so vituperative and vitriolic that it just defies the possibility of discussion. Now, some people, I have to say, let's be clear, there is a difference between disagreement and people who are ideologues. And you read the dissent in Nevson. On my court in the last 4 or 5 years, we had a couple of people who were, I mean, leaning conservative, leaning progressive is one thing. Ideology means if the brain is this, then if you're an open mind, then what you hear may change the shape of your brain. If you are an ideologue, of which there are many, then it doesn't matter what you hear, the shape, it takes the facts, fit into this, into the shape that's there. So that's a problem, and I admit that. But when you're dealing with ideology, you just have to say, I'm not even going to try, because there's no point. And I think we have to be willing not to make accommodation with people who are not prepared to make accommodation with you. So that's my hardline position. Oh my goodness, your question. I mean, we started with Grotius, where international law was about states. And we stayed there for centuries. International law was relationships between governments. And then the Second World War reminded us that governments could be abusive, like we really needed that horrific an example to see the obvious. And that's when we came up with these new instruments, new legal instruments. There is nothing wrong with those legal instruments. If you read the Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, and all of the conventions that emerged from 1945, they're still good. That's not the problem. Their enforcement is working very well in most democracies, not in the countries that aren't. So people who need them don't get access to them. So I would say the problem is not with the laws. The problem is with people's access to the possibility of having those laws implemented and enforced. And how do you do that in a domestic environment where the government is not prepared to give you those rights and appoints the judges who won't give you those rights, even if you wanted to, like many of the countries that are falling in Europe to autocracies, to autocratic rule. You can't change those countries if they're not willing. Which brings me back to the United Nations. I told you that it took China 10 years to get into the WTO. This cup could get into the United Nations. It's so easy to be a member, and it's a majoritarian General Assembly. They decide the norms for the world. And anybody can decide the norms of the world who has no norms and no rules. And they sit side by side with the United States and Canada and England in deciding what is appropriate for international morality. I mean, look at the goals of the United Nations, the 4 goals, and tell me which one of them is being met now. Because we want to be fair to everybody. Well, fair to everybody always means that it's not fair to the people who need it most. So it's not a happy answer, but I don't hear very many people calling out the United Nations. I don't hear very many people calling out the failure of the ICC or the International Court of Justice, how long it takes, how hopeless it is. And I attribute only good motives to the people in those institutions, on those courts, only good motives. But how long does it take to get to get a remedy that you need now.
Thanks. I think we have room for 1.5 more questions. Rocky?
Rocky Whites, I'm Director of Maritime Studies here, which includes Arctic. So I have an Arctic question for you.
It's very cold.
Yeah, most of the time, not all the time. So I happen to be in Norway with a group of young Arctic indigenous peoples, including from Canada. And one of them told me something that shocked me, which was that boarding schools in Canada were forcibly taking indigenous youth up until 1998. That shocked me. And then this is related. So there's two shocking, Canada shocked me twice this year. That was one shock, okay? That didn't make the news. The other was the Nazi SS standing ovation. I was just shocked that that could happen. So can you comment on both of those?
Absolutely.
How do these things happen in Canada?
Did you think I wasn't going to? You could see how shy I was.
I
when
can
expressing
imagine
my views.
So tell us how you really feel.
So the first one, the residential school, I mean, the history of Canada is, like many countries, a history of evolutionary awareness. When I told you that we weren't allowed into Canada as Jews, we knew we didn't know why there was an we didn't even know it was an anti-Semitic policy. All we knew was we wanted to come to Canada. I never, ever stopped asking my father why we went to Canada instead of New York, where they have Broadway. And he just somehow thought Canada would be more peaceful than the United States. But when my husband wrote a book called None is Too Many in 1982, which talked about how Canada had, he and a co-author researched the archives and found out that Canada had a deliberate policy, and the book has now been reissued. I did the audio version this summer, and reading it again and coming to the part near the end where they talked about post-World War II, when Canada still refused, knowing what had happened in the Holocaust, still refused to let refugees in, and finally let in 33,000, and my family were 5 of those 33,000. Shocking. So 1982, Canada discovered the anti-Semitism that was endemic in the Canadian government in the Second World War. In the 90s and 2000s, we started to hear stories about the Indigenous community. Actually, I think it's fair to say, Ian, tell me if I'm wrong, we didn't really know what was going on in Indigenous communities in Canada generally until a judge named Tom Berger was asked by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was, I think, the greatest prime minister we've ever had, because he gave us the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to do a royal commission, which is an inquiry into whether or not there should be a pipeline along the West Coast. And Berger spent a year, and what he did was he invited the press to come with him along to see the Indigenous communities along the West Coast. And no one had ever taken the press on a royal commission before. And guess what they discovered? The poverty, the disadvantage of the Indigenous people. People said, oh, how long has this been going on? Forever. But we didn't know until Berger did his report. That was the beginning. And then as we gave charter rights to the Indigenous communities, they became a stronger, more vocal. We discovered that Canada's official policy, that they had tolerated the scooping of children, Indigenous children from the reserves, away from their families, not allowed to speak their language. These were religious organizations who took the kids and kept them for years and abused them.
Yeah, it was bad.
And it's still going, I mean, we are still discovering what has happened over those years. A shock to Canada. So there will still be things that we discover. Like we knew that we interned Japanese Canadians because we had a court case where the Supreme Court of Canada, like the American Supreme Court, said nothing wrong with the internment of the Japanese Canadians in America. What? So we're learning, we're still learning, but what we're doing is responding effectively. And that's the difference. It's the discovery of abuse and responding when you discover it. So there wasn't an equivocal reaction to either the anti-Semitism that they discovered or the residential schools that they discovered. We discovered the Indigenous community knew all along that their children were being scooped up. And it's terrifying. Now, the war crimes. So part of what my husband did after he wrote his book was he just went on a crusade. He was he was a history professor, but he was the president of the Canadian Jewish Congress at one point too. And he went on a crusade against how many war criminals Canada let in. And in 1997, went on 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace and said it was easier to get into Canada after the Second World War if you were a war criminal than if you were a Jewish refugee.
Yeah.
That came back in a Erwin Kotler found it and tweeted it, and it went viral when this Ukrainian soldier was brought into the House of Commons to honor Zelensky in Parliament and got a standing ovation because the Speaker of the House didn't realize that any Ukrainian soldier who fought the Russians in the Second World War was fighting with the Germans, and he may not have been technically a Nazi, but he fought with the SS, and the SS grouping that he was a part of killed Jews. So that was embarrassing. How did that happen? Maybe people don't follow history. Somebody didn't do their homework, but it was shocking how long it took for the speaker to resign and for the government to apologize. It was an embarrassment to Zelensky. But it was because there were all these war criminals in Canada and they were allowed to stay. Now, why were they allowed to stay? What we started hearing when people started saying, there are all these war criminals in Canada was, come on, they're old men. What do you want? To which my husband used to respond, there was a Canadian criminal whose name was Clifford Olson, who found and killed little boys. And he used to say, if they had found Clifford Olson when he was 80 years old, would they have said, well, he's only 80, he's 80 years old, let it go. There's really nothing you can do at this point. And to ask the question is to answer it. So is there anti-Semitism still? There is. Is it better than it was? I suppose. I'm here. I was a first Jewish woman on the Supreme Court of Canada. We had 4 when I was there. Much better. Still going on, but it's competing now with a whole lot of other hates. And that's what scares me. The level of hatred in the world towards each other, the inability to come together under the umbrella of international law, international norms, international morality, international standards. They're there. They're just not being enforced.
Thanks so much. I think this probably brings us close to the end of this. We've covered a very diverse range of subjects, starting with the question, where is our moral center as a humanity? The crisis of international institutions and the role of international law in that, particularly customary international law use cogents, and how to make those work for real people in real locations and real countries and real situations. And the Nefson Resources case has been a practical case study. If you've not read that, make the effort to audit it at some point. It's a classic. And then in all of that, what's the role of courts? What's the role of national judges? And how do you afford folks access to the courts, access to legal process, access to remedies? And while we are at that, there's a notion that I thought was that our attention has been called to. You can have access to court. It doesn't mean anything if you can't exit from court. So it's not just access to courts, but exit, timely exit from courts. That's the point I also get from this. And which of course will hack to the point of timely exit from this room.
That's a good enforcement mechanism.
On behalf of all of us and in our collective names as the Fletcher community, can we please give a resounding welcome to our speaker, and thank you too.
It was an honor to be here, and I wish all of you success in every part of the international law world that you're embarking on. And
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
yeah.
That's for your plate, Marina.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So generous.
No, it's too many. I'm going to acquire them. I'm going to, the title alone.
Yeah, well, that's a Canadian. It's asked by.
What a jolly.
Would you allow?
Seriously. Wow.
It shocked Canadians who thought we were.
Wow. My immediate elder sister became Canadian 3 years ago.
You what, sorry?
My elder sister became Canadian 3 years ago.
I still think it's the best country
I
now
always forget about this.
because we can.
And that's all
That's all you can do.
That's all you can do. And then working hard at making sure they don't recur. Exactly. Exactly. If you go on,
This was an LLM.
yes. So there are, we call it LLM, but a few of them here were also on the mold program, Master of Arts in Law.
Oh, I see.
That's interesting.
I think this is relevant to that.
No, this was fantastic. Yes, and some of them do the mold because they're trying to decide whether they want to go to.
No, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine.
Yes, I love it.
So no, it's very tricky.
So. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was great. I'm not from the legal world at all.
I just found out that there were some interlopers.
Exactly. But it was a great discussion. Well, I had to
Oh, thank you.
because you have to get central.
Not decentralized, centralized. Decentralized in the sense that each state is responsible.
Exactly.
Oh, yes, but I still believe in central institutions, functioning institutions.
But how in entities growing, ensure that there is a
Well, you can't.
cooperation.
That's the problem. So the EU, for instance, had a chance to stop
Word
Poland
or-
from doing what it did quickly. But then it was done, it was in place, the judicial system had been.
Thank you
in place.
very much. Thank
So
you.
what's the point of these institutions?
This also maybe, I think I get the thrust of the question is well, I'm only moderate or less skeptical than you.
I'm gonna turn off the recording.
You do have to come who at least try to push the autocracy. So
Oh,
maybe-
yes.
Maybe the Canadian Supreme Court will have the progressive jurisprudence, but it's not gonna happen in Poland. it's not gonna happen. So,
No, he's
you know,
not.
the EU's not pushing for it.
So. Oh, they have to push for it, but they have to do it in a timely way. Timely is so